Hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, depending on where you are and what time it is in the world and where you're even watching from. Hopefully it's somewhere beautiful. Welcome, Russ. Thank you, Russ Dyble, for joining me today. Russ is a very experienced property investor. He's a mentor, he's a trainer, owner of a lettings business as well, a wealth of experience. And today we're going to look at how the pandemic has affected the business in all sorts of different levels. How are you, Russ? Nice to see you.
I'm good, thank you, Simon. Yeah, very well.
Great.
Keeping busy as always, out of trouble.
Right, Russ, what are we going to talk about first? I guess tell me, how's the last, 20 months been for you? March 23rd, 2020 is a date in history I think we'll never forget. In that immediate first few weeks, what happened with you and your business? Was there lots of well, tell me. It must have been a bit of a, like everyone else was going, what should we do? I think there was a massive rabbit in the headlights moment, wasn't there, for a while?
Yeah, and I think there's three elements to this. There's the personal, so we all sat and thought, not been through this before. What does it mean? What's going to happen? A bit of trying to sort of support people. I remember we had a meeting with the cleaners a few days before the lockdown, and I remember them saying to us, well, are they going to close the schools? Surely they can't close the schools. And I said, yep, I think if they're talking about it, they're trailing it, it's going to happen. And there was that kind of being an employer, but also being a leader, which was quite interesting. And in my other roles, I do a lot of voluntary work. There were lots of people looking for leadership, not just, from me, but in my particular instance, there were people looking to me, looking for leadership. And that was interesting. From a business perspective, then you've also got two elements, which is the customers and the clients. So, lots of tenants asking, what happens if I can't pay my rent? What happens if I lose my job? What happens? And lots of landlords wanting to know what we're going to do. So there's that element of dealing with customers and clients, but also thinking, okay, what happens to our business? So as a business owner, regardless of whether I'm in property or whatever, what on earth happens if our income drops by 50%? Because our income is driven by rental, people can't pay their rent. At this point, obviously, the furlough scheme hadn't happened. So there's lots of, in my mind, risk assessing. My background is in or part of my background is really in sort of crisis management and responding to things that you're not necessarily expecting. So from that point of view, I think I've had a fair bit of clarity that you just got to focus on the most important things and the things you can control. And that for me was really understanding what the risks were. So we spent quite a long time looking at each individual tenant, literally tenant by tenant. What was their job profile? What was the likelihood of them losing a job? What was the likelihood of them having some savings, and what was the likelihood of them being able to transfer into similar work? So, for example, when people who are working on relatively low income, which the majority of our tenants are, sort of probably between the £9 and I would say around about £11, £12, those people can transfer jobs relatively easily. So if you worked in a bar, you could go and get a job in a supermarket, and many of our tenants did. And in fact, we ended up for a couple of weeks feeling more like a recruitment agency than a letting agency, where we were helping tenants with our local connections, trying to understand where the other jobs were. So, for example, all the bars shut, but all the supermarkets and Amazon warehouses started to recruit because there was a lot more demand for their services. So we helped people try and connect with, what's your challenge now and how can we help you? The byproduct being they've got some stability back in their life. They can pay their rent, so they're not worried about that, and our income stabilises as well. So lots of sort of reasons for doing that.
And did you have you mentioned savings and stuff? Did you have very specific conversations with each tenant then to find out their position, so that you could then, with what you just explained, with the intention of then helping them?
Not so much about not so much with individual tenants specifically on block. So over a period of 2, 3, 4 weeks, yes, lots of tenants did speak to us. We collect quite a lot of information in the application process, so we know what their job is, we know what their income is, We've seen sight of their bank statements, although we can't go back to those once they've passed
Mm.
referencing. But what we did was basically a very simple red, amber, green risk assessment of, if they're an NHS worker, for example, the chances are they're going to still be working and have their income. If they work in a bar, they're likely to lose their income, but they're not going to finding other work at the same rate too difficult. And the ones that we coded red for the biggest risk were high income people who might lose a contract overnight like that. The nature of contract work,
Mm.
senior managers in places where maybe they're in a room with us as a second place, so that they come here for 3 or 4 nights a week, they do their job, then they go home, they've still got a mortgage to pay. So those people potentially would lose their income and leave quite quickly. And then those that the very highest risk were those that were likely to lose their income, were likely to have high expenses, but were permanent resident in our rooms. Because if somebody leaves a room, they're not racking up arrears. In the situation,
Mm.
landlords could understand. And actually, we always say having possession of a room is better than having a tenant building up arrears. So that was our sort of process. And I remember very clearly watching the press conference that Rishi Sunak did about furlough, and just thinking that probably has saved my business. That's probably saved me making 10 people redundant and losing one of our sources of income. So that kind of level of staying up in the
Yeah.
news was pretty important.
Yeah, I mean, it was. I think that first 3 or 4 weeks, I was looking back recently, sort of through my little journal of the time, and I remember saying, "Oh, we've got 3 weeks of lockdown," and then 3 weeks later, we've got another 3 weeks of lockdown. I actually wrote, "Is there any end in sight?"
Right.
And and I was rereading that, or well over a year later, thinking, "Crikey, we haven't really moved on much in 12 months." So it was such an uncertain time, but we got through it, and I think there was lots of lessons learned. I mean, you put together sort of a blueprint of crisis management now for from what you've learned there, or had you sort of got similar thoughts in place already?
Nothing particularly sort of written down, but I think we're probably still living through this process. I think we sort of think
Mm.
about it quite often. I think the thing for me is the whole point of crisis management is that you probably don't expect what's going to happen. So you can plan for the unexpected, but it's the unexpected that actually catches you out. The main thing, and this is
Yes.
what I learned, from 10 years of doing this in a different life, was the main thing is about communicating with people, thinking right
Mm.
from the beginning, who does this affect, and how and when do they need to be told what's happening and what support's available. Once you do that,
Mhm.
that sort of settles people's thing. So we did a couple of live stream podcasts, for example, for landlords, one aimed at landlords, one aimed at tenants. We recorded video messages and put them in all our house WhatsApp groups so that we could get a lot of information to people very quickly, which meant that the
Mm.
phone lines weren't jammed, having individual one-to-one conversations with people asking the same question. What they then could do was digest how we were able to support them and then contact us individually about their particular circumstance. So it's that kind of trying to buy yourself a bit of time to think at the beginning by putting a bit of information in people's hands and then reacting to the individuals once they're not asking all the same questions.
Mm. I mean, that talking all about communication there, and that was what I always felt was the message was lacking in all of the news pieces I saw, on specific industry-based forums and news sites and stuff. Is that there was worries about arrears and tenants being evicted and homelessness going up. But sadly, what I was never seeing was tips to landlord, or was very rarely seeing to landlords saying, "Look, communicate with your tenants, speak to them as often as you need to get the information so that you can work together." And there were some messages coming through, but that's news agencies, isn't it? They'll always
Yeah.
make things dramatic and sound dreadful.
Yeah.
I mean, jumping forward to now, then, now that furlough is over, and we're life is moving forward. I mean, how do you see? I mean, with tenants and arrears. I mean, there's so much worry and concern now about rent arrears and families that have hit by COVID. That are low earners or they're on universal credit. They've had their 20% top up cut. There's a lot of calls for government aid financially and shelter. They're shouting about having government creating a grant, because their figures, according to Shelter, their figures, there's 1 in 5 renters have been affected and are horribly in arrears, and there's a figure of something like 800,000 people by the end of the year will be in dreadful arrears. What sort of ideas or tips, if you like, have you got for there? Is it continuing the communication with your tenants
Yeah, I think there's a couple of bits
to
there.
help them
So,
out with their arrears?
yeah, so I mean, we perhaps with this is where we are fortunate in that our tenant type in rooms are generally on relatively low rents and everything's included. So what's hitting families as well as a lack of income is rising prices. So in a single let, you maybe have got, let's
Mm,
assume two people who've been working, maybe one's been reduced, or made redundant, or jobs changed, or what have you. But on top of that, you've also then got gas bills going up, the electric bills going up, cost of food's going up. So all these things are variables. Whereas in rooms, they're predominantly the biggest cost. Housing is a fixed price; everything's included, and rooms. So we're actually seeing relatively stable, a manageable level of arrears. And I would say our biggest challenge has been the won't pay people as opposed to the can't pay. So those that can't pay
mhm.
generally will communicate very well, and they will have a conversation and they will accept help and they'll be directed to the right people that are able to help. They're also at a stage where the level of rent arrears is not hugely above universal credit. So our biggest fallback was, as long as the government keep paying universal credit, we're probably going to cover 80% of our rent, but we may just need to switch to supporting a lot more people on universal credit than they're used to. So for a lot of people, the biggest challenge was taking benefits for the first time in their lives. The single lets are a bit more challenging because of all the other things, and obviously it's a lot harder for a family to downsize and change their housing costs. Whereas in a room, you can move from a medium priced room to a smaller, cheaper room relatively quickly. You haven't got things to think about like, where's the dog going to go? Have we got enough room for all the kids? How do we get to school? So I think there are very different challenges in two parts of that rental market. There is also a lot of misinformation out there, I have to say. A lot of tenancy contracts default to advising to signposting tenants to go to certain services, who frankly are either um, misinformed themselves or trying to create a bigger problem. So we have quite a lot of problems with tenants, for example, coming back saying, well, such and such agency said this to me. And actually, that's not the legal position. That might be what they think morally, but the legal position is that you can still be evicted. The notices have gone back down. Not paying your rent at all isn't going to help you. For example, making a contribution to paying what you can probably will help you if it goes to court. Not paying anything probably isn't. And it's very, very frustrating when we're genuinely trying. Yes, our job as letting agent is to get rent paid, but we're also human beings, so we understand. And what we're trying to do all the time is broker that the landlord is getting at least some of the rent, but also that families aren't being put in an incredibly difficult position. But ultimately, that rent does have to be paid. So when we've got, whether it's government agencies, advice people, I'm trying desperately hard not to name anybody so we don't get into trouble. Certain charities in the sector just giving incorrect information. It's incredibly frustrating.
These agencies make landlords out to be, ogres, and that's a real thing that landlords are still trying to get away from. That we're not
No.
Rigsby's. If you're not old enough to know what Rigsby is, for those of you watching, then ask your dad or your granddad even. But we're not money grabbing megalomaniacs who only look at the pound signs and don't speak to people. I mean, from my point of view, as soon as a tenant goes quiet on me, I do think, oh, crap, what's going on? And I'm on the phone or I'm texting just to say, how's things? Are you all right? Just to start with, and gently saying, what not, where's my rent? Pay
Yeah.
my rent.
And that's where we distinguish very much between the won't pays and the can't pays. And our experience is that in the vast majority of cases, it's the can't pays that don't communicate. You the won't pays don't communicate. The can't pays sometimes put their head in the sand, but then often will come up and ask for help. Very occasionally it gets on top of them, but generally the can't pays, the people who are really struggling, do kind of reach to us and say, this is the situation. What can we do? The can't pays dig their heels in, and that's where, as a letting agent or as a landlord, you really need to then just follow the process. Step one, anything that happens, just follow that process, and often that will kick the can't pays into action because they realise that it's getting serious and they then communicate. And what you said there is absolutely right. About landlords, the vast majority are not hugely wealthy people, only interested in money. Lots of landlords in the country actually only have one or two properties, the vast majority, according to the various surveys that have been done. And one of the challenges there is that, in that sense, that if the income for the landlord stops from one property, they are actually in a really difficult position. And one of the things, obviously, we teach at Asset Academy is about putting over some of the rent into a fund so that you can weather some of these storms that come. And thinking what might happen. Some of the courses that I've been involved with, we regularly say to people, what happens if 80% of your people, 20% of your people can't pay rent? What happens if, property prices drop 20% overnight?
I think Mark on Creative Finance even has a higher figure than that. I think he even goes to 50%, doesn't he? He'll say, what if 50% can't pay?
Yeah, and when we do that, people say, "Oh, well, what's the likelihood of that happens?" And Mark's always said, "Well, that's what happened in 2008."
Mm,
And as we're teaching from now on, he'll be saying, "Well, that's what happened in 2008, and that's what very nearly happened in 2020."
mm,
So these things are not common, but it's about that. It's about those good habits, I guess, that
mm,
sustain you when an unexpected incident happens. We're not expecting your portfolio to run at 80% occupancy or collections, but at some point there might be a shock where it
mm,
does for a period, and obviously that's what we teach. A lot of amateur landlords, with one or two properties, the boiler goes and needs a couple of £100 and they don't have the money because they've
mm,
spent it, because they're not treating it as a business. And I think that's where, if you're with what I call a business landlord, somebody who understands that there are bumps in the road that will come along, your experience as a tenant will probably be much better,
mm.
because there'll be a bit of understanding and there'll be a bit of leeway, rather than the first thing that where tenants in trouble puts the landlord in trouble, and then both sides are panicking, and that's really where issues start to happen.
There's lots of things you've said there that I really want to touch on. Where do I start? I mean, the first one I was thinking is just sticking with the pandemic for a moment, and but shifting over to the landlord's point of view. Even before the pandemic, we'd had lots of tax changes and legislation changes, and there was a lot, there's a lot of pressure on landlords. And at the moment, I think it was Property Market, I think last week or maybe this week, they've really, amongst others, are putting pressure on Rishi Sunak to change things up in the budget and spending review that's coming up soon. And one of their big worries is there's going to be a big exodus of landlords from the industry. They're saying maybe 20% might leave, which of course is going to cause a real shortage in property available to the renters. A couple of things then. Do you think landlords have been asked to carry too much of the burden over this last sort of nearly 2 years now, to 20 months or so?
I don't think they've been asked to. I do think it's been forced on them, and I think, like a lot of government changes, it's a reaction to one thing that the chain reaction doesn't necessarily get considered. So the
Mm,
tax relief thing, for example, political capital tick, political tax income probably tick a little bit. Um, the reality is, business people will always find a way to mitigate to some extent the effect of that. And let's not forget, the vast majority of MPs are landlords, so they're not going to be the turkeys that vote for Christmas, are they? It's not going to be as bad as they make out. But yeah, I do think often that things are introduced, and it seems like a good idea in an office in government. And I think the industry bodies, the NRLA and people like that, I think they have a voice, but the reality is, I think they have a very small voice compared to the machinery of government. That somebody's made a decision, and that's really it. So
Mm,
yeah, I think landlords. And this is the problem. We see a lot of landlords where historically landlords haven't been looking at this as a business. They're all of a sudden, probably, say all of a sudden, probably over 10 years, very much now being put in a position where there's a huge amount of regulation, right to rent checks, all of these things that are expected of them. And there's an element of me that does think government policy is moving towards wanting professional landlords because
mm,
they're being limited companies, it's easier to tax. They can put some of these responsibilities on landlords and expect that they're done properly.
mm,
So things like your Section 1021 being removed, all of those, I think there's lots of little things that are pointing to
mm,
the government do want it done properly. And I think they're probably hedging their bets on the fact that if 20% of landlords sell up 20% of the properties, the reality is people like you and I are the people that are likely to buy them and
mm.
actually keep them in rental stock, but run them better as a business. And I
Yeah,
think that I think in a sort of cack-handed way, I think that's what the government are trying to do
yeah.
without wanting to say.
Mm. I mean, the renters reform bill. I'll wanted to ask you about that, but we talked about the smaller landlords with one, two, and three properties. I mean, that was spawned probably, well, most definitely, I would say, by the advent of the buy-to-let mortgage back in '96. When I think John Major was Prime Minister, Spice Girls got their first number one, football was coming home.
I
We're
was
still
still at
waiting for
primary
that one,
school.
huh?
I was still at primary school.
I was working in a pub trying to be an actor, but anyway. Um, do you think then? I mean, you sort of hinted at it already that those landlords, the landlords who bought, the people who bought one property that they saw as a pension pot. Do you think they're the ones that are likely to go out of the market? Then are they the people that property markets suggesting are going to leave because they don't get the regulations, they're frightened of the regulations, they're not making as much money as they used to because of tax? Is it those sort of people that are going to be leaving?
Yeah, I think so. I think you've got three types of landlords. You've got professional landlords, amateur landlords, and slumlords. And
Mm,
I think the amateur landlords will be pushed out. I think the professional landlords will do well, and unfortunately, the slum landlords will continue
mm,
to do things without following the rules, and to be honest, without particularly being caught either. And that's my
mm,
frustration
mm,
with this industry. Is a lot of money is paid by the professionals to comply and provide funding for local government to
mm,
enforce, and the enforcement never seems to. It always seems to enforce on the people trying to do the right thing, but not quite making everything happen.
mm.
And not a lot seems to happen with the people who are just completely flouting the rules, and that to me seems unfair.
Do you think that? I would say the answer is yes to this. That I feel anyway that there's not enough funding goes into hunting down, well, for want of a better phrase, those slum landlords, the road landlords. Um, do you think that how can any ideas how that money can be put into the right resource to get rid of these slum landlords? I mean, those because the slum landlords are the landlords that the likes of Shelter and Generation Rent label as the ogres, as the bad guys that end up tarnishing the good guys, don't they?
Yeah, I think the reality of it is probably that if you're sat in an office thinking we need to raise some money in order um, to keep funding the enforcement. We got six. Let's say we got six officers in XYZ council. If we go out and give a few fines, we can keep you all on. If not, um, one of you is going to be made redundant. The reality is, you're going to go and pick on the little guy who's probably put their head above the parapet, said,
Mm.
I don't know what I'm doing. I think I might have got it right, but can I have some help? I'm afraid they're the ones that are going to get the fines. The
Yeah.
people that have never ever applied for a HMO license, the council, they do go after them. But the reality is as well, because we live in a fairly liberal Western society, they can't just do what other countries would do, which is just put a rope around the house and say that's not yours anymore. And that's whilst there's a market for people there who will rent from those people because there are no checks and because the rents are lower and because they'll take it in cash. And it then makes the whole thing very much more difficult for enforcement to be taken. So it is a vicious catch-22
Mm.
situation. I do feel a bit sorry for the local authorities, but ultimately, I guess they've got targets to hit about how many people they can enforce against, and they'll go after the ones they think they'll get a result from, and
Yeah, I guess
that's
same as any
understandable.
enforcement team in any sector, isn't it? They'll go for the easy target, which is sad.
Yeah.
Um, there
But
used
that's
to
not to
be.
decry the work they do.
No, no, of course not. No.
They obviously do
Mm.
work very hard, but they have to be realistic about what can they achieve.
Mm. Moving on to a bit of a different subject then, for tenants. Since the pandemic, cause COVID, are tenants looking for different features in their properties now? I mean, let's think of one sector, a small family that need a three-bedroom property. Are they looking for different features than they were, say, 2 years ago?
I mean, we don't do a huge amount in family lets. We're predominantly rooms. I
Mm.
think people are moving. I think they're a bit more conscious about where they want to live. And again, you've got really those that can afford to be choosy, and unfortunately, those that can't afford to be choosy
Mhm.
end up in the lap of. I mean, we've just given back the management of a number of properties because we've said, look, I'm sorry, this isn't acceptable. We're not comfortable managing this. We've reported it to the local authority because the landlords just won't do the right thing. So
Mhm.
I think there is an element where the vast majority of people realise that they want to be in a good, decent home, and that for me is a great thing. People ought to be able to expect that from a rental property.
And those then in sort of the room and co-living sort of space, then are they after a different features? Do you think that's um, for those on lower incomes, and do you think that's going to be a change? Is that something that the pandemic has affected? That you touched on it earlier. Some people have had to move into a cheaper property. Is there going to be more co-living space? And quality co-living that's sort of almost like having your own home, but obviously you share it with three, four, five, whatever. Is that a way that the sector's moving a little bit or
I
growing a
think
bit?
I think yeah, the reality we're not seeing many families downsize,
Mm.
but I guess again because we're not in that market, maybe we're not seeing the challenge that people are. I think they're maybe cutting back in the room market. I mean, we're buoyant at the moment. I would say through COVID we averaged probably 85, high 80% occupancy. And that's gone, and that's at the peak of real lockdown. And we did quite a lot of that was around the city centre, where the retail, the hospitality, the student market just went home and were able to go back to mum and dad. But quite quickly that recovered. We're
Mhm.
up to about 98, 99% occupancy. We track that daily. We're constantly adding in our business, probably 8 to 12 rooms a month is what we add in terms of new properties, and that occupancies remain there. What we're definitely seeing, whether it's because of COVID or just the way the market's moving generally, we are seeing people prepared to pay quite high room rent in return for bigger, better quality rooms. We've always had good quality rooms in terms of, the heat, the light, the warmth, the clean, tidy, and what have you. But the industry as a whole and our businesses in particular have definitely generated. I don't like the word boutique, but that kind of
Mm.
high standard, high end living, where people really feel they're not just in a magnolia box in a bigger box, they're in a home.
Mm.
And we're seeing tenants average tenancy lengths lengthen. We're seeing occupancy rates go up. We're seeing collections go up. And certainly from our perspective as a business, our portfolio, we're investing our latest project that we've just finished. All the rooms are at least 12, 13 square meters, up to sort of 20, where your standard four bed shared house would be between 7 square meters and probably
Mm.
12 or 14. The project we're doing now, we're looking at quite a big project, 17 rooms in total, minimum room size 15 square meters up to 30 square meters. You've almost got like almost the size of a one bed flat.
Yeah.
And what people
That
really
that's a
want,
good sized flat in London, by the way.
yeah, I bet. So they've still got and it's not 17 rooms all sharing. It's not like university halls. It's subdivided with different entrances, 5 kitchen diners. So it's just a big building, but it's basically 5 HMOs in one building. And we're seeing a lot of excitement about that when we're talking about it with tenants, because we can then offer really nice rooms, great accommodation. The economics of it work for us, which means we can provide it. The tenants got a great service, and now we're also looking at things like, within that, could we then work with local companies, for example, dry cleaners, for example. If they're coming to one building with 17 people in it, they can do that. So there's lots of things we can then add on to make the lifestyle better.
Mm-hmm.
And that we're definitely, so many of our houses have 2 or 3 Just Eat deliveries a day. There's a convenience lifestyle that goes along with living in a HMO.
Mm.
So we're now seeing, okay, well, what convenience do you want us to build into that life, into your living space, where, in a 17 bed, we could potentially have a cook, for
Yeah.
example, who says, who wants a packed lunch for tomorrow to take to work, and who wants to eat, dinner tonight is X, who would like that?
And
These are all sort of ideas we're playing around with now.
and the quality rooms and the size of room, does that mean, are you finding your tenants are staying longer?
Yeah,
Over the average, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, I've seen, you talked about boutique sort of places. I've seen lots of photos over the last few months from a number of Asset Academy students and their latest HMO projects. And I mean, one I even messaged and said, "Looks amazing. When can I move in?" I mean, it was absolutely stunning. It was beautiful. It would look like a boutique hotel, and so it's that sort of stuff that really keeps the tenants in. Do you think?
I think so. I think it attracts people, and it also says that the landlord cares, and I think that's a big draw. And I have to say, it also changes the relationship between tenant and letting agent, because we're also under more pressure to react like a boutique hotel. So people expect to be able to get hold of somebody 24/7. It almost sometimes feels like we are a concierge service. And we have to manage that a little bit, because people are paying a lot now for their accommodation.
Yeah.
Some of our latest rooms, over £600 a room in a market town. We're not London. We're not central city centre. This is a market town in the West Midlands, and I think that level of product has risen. And I think what landlords need to be aware and letting agents need to be aware is that the service needs to rise as well. In a way that's sustainable from a cost point of view.
And from your point of view, energy efficiency, how important is that? I mean, there's a big announcement yesterday of the £5,000 grant for switching over to heat pumps. There's lots of conversation around that, but generally speaking, energy efficiency in your properties, how important is that for you?
I mean, look, as a landlord, and this is what tenants think we care about: paying the rent and how much heating they're using. If I'm honest, most landlords there will be driven by the cost of energy rather than the green credentials. I think some will have that in the front of their mind. We happen to use a supplier who is 100% green energy, in our properties, and that's. But that is a decision driven largely by cost, I have to say.
Yeah.
It's probably a secondary consideration, and it's important. I think as we go forward, lots of landlords will jump on that bandwagon. Call me a cynic, but the rising gas price now is probably a nice time to announce that for the government, that new scheme.
Well, yes, I mean, I think that crossed everybody's mind, and it was a point I made yesterday as well in a little news bulletin I did. The cost of the equipment is still quite pricey. I mean, the big hope is from Kwasi Kwarteng's point of view, and that's he was at pains to say, was that this grant will help it reduce in price over the coming sort of 10 years or so. And one or two providers say, look, with the grant, it's going to cost you about the same as replacing a new boiler anyway. But of course, there's got it's the insulation involved as well. I mean, I'm talking particularly about heat pumps. So I think it's the early adopters, isn't it, that are going to, provide us with real world evidence, and in 10 years' time, when we're getting a bit closer to that 2035 deadline that the government are setting, the cost of it will be a bit more balanced, one hopes.
I mean, it is something that we're conscious of. So we're managing a couple of refurbs at the moment, and we're looking at the one that we're doing where there'll be 5 separate heating systems, and we're going down the no gas route. We tend to put electric induction hobs in anyway because leaving gas on is quite dangerous, whereas leaving an induction hob on is not. So I think overall, for lots of different reasons, there's a move probably more towards using electric. But I think that will go over time, and it's the usual thing, isn't it? Supply and demand. If there's more demand created for the heat pumps because the government are going to give us 80% of the cost of it, then hopefully it does bring down the cost of it overall, and people do move to something that is more green and sustainable in the long run.
I mean, on the back burner, if you'll excuse the pun, there's also hydrogen heating as well. I know there's a test going on in a village in the northeast at the moment where they're integrating hydrogen into the system, but we'll see where that goes. Sticking with the effects of the pandemic and particularly about your business, no doubt you had to change a lot of things. There was lots of. Did you do virtual viewings and that sort of stuff?
We did a little bit. We always do 360-degree virtual tours that people can walk around the property.
Is that something do you think will stick? That you'll keep on, that will be adopted generally, widespread across the business? I mean, I know estate agents, they, as soon as they were able to, they were doing virtual viewings, and there was, and there's since been lots of talk of people keeping it, and the advantages of it. You can save a lot of time before you go and view the property that you're pretty sure you're going to either offer on or, from a rental point of view, want to move into. Do you think it's going to stick around?
I've got mixed views on this. So we offer virtual tours. We've got them on the vast majority of our properties. I guess what I can't see is how many people look at them online. I can see some stats, but when I do look, it's not huge numbers. The thing is, really, I want to see the person in person. Actually, is the bigger issue. So whether it helps them filter down where they want to see, I'm not sure. I think a lot of people will just be happy looking at photos. What we find from tenants is they want to see that the property actually still looks like that. So we tend to do more video viewings, live, WhatsApp, FaceTime, whatever, which facilitates the viewer not having to be there. But it means that they can see what the house actually looks like now rather than when it was all done 2 years ago. But also we want to see that individual. We want to see, are they likely to be a good fit for the house? Do they present well? Are they on time? All those things that give us an indication that they're going to be a good tenant. So we've not really gone down the road of giving people lots of viewings and working purely off those virtual viewings. We would still want to see somebody in the property.
Well, I thought similar lines. I mean, when virtual viewing sort of came in as an out of necessity, I thought, well, that's great, but you still, even from a buyer or a tenant's point of view, they still want to come into the building and have a look and make sure. So it's, for me, I thought, it streamlines a little, especially if you're thinking from an investor point of view as well. If your investment area is 4 hours away, if you can look at 10, 20 properties virtually one day and then make the appointments and go and see 2 that you're sort of 80%. Sure you're going to offer on. I think that's helpful. What about right to rent checks? At the moment, you've got the ability to do that virtually, and that's sticking around until April next year. Do you think that should stay, or do you, in a similar way to actually meeting the tenant in person, do you still want to see the original documents? I mean, I can see the sort of flaws and maybe a nervousness from a letting agent point of view about doing that sort of thing. Because you've got to get it right, otherwise, you as a letting agent are in trouble.
Yeah, I think here, this is one of the things where we touched back on the conversation earlier about landlords becoming an extension of the government and having lots of things thrust on them that maybe they're not particularly well qualified to do anyway. As a letting agent, obviously, we're a bit more used to it. From my perspective, if I can buy a house and have my ID checked online via Zoom, I think renting a property should really be the same rules. The reality is, if I'm being shown a duff document, it's going to be probably quite a good fake, and whether I'm showing it in person or online, I'm probably not going to be able to tell the difference. So this is really about making sure that the process is there to discourage people from trying to do it. The absolute professionals probably will get through anyway, whether it's online. So I think the reality is we have to be pragmatic in this day and age. That we can probably do that from an application point of view online.
Has it
But
made the process more efficient doing it virtually like that? I
it
mean,
definitely,
expedited it? Do you get through that process? Because it can be quite laborious at times going through all the different checks.
yeah. So we do. The nice thing is that people can now we can check it, and we use an external referencing company. So they check it, they have it uploaded to their portal. The nice thing is it puts some of the burden of administration on the tenant. Actually, that's the biggest benefit, because we used to have to take a picture, file it on the system, put it in the right place, all those things. Whereas now, because the tenant can show it online and then take a picture of it, it then goes straight into the system where we need it. So in that sense, the online helps the letting agent. The other thing is, we don't particularly want to just leave a set of keys for somebody to go into a property, because we don't know who is actually taking custody of those keys. So to ask somebody just to show their ID again in person when we give them a set of keys, whether they come to the office or whether we check them in on, in the property, it's not a huge challenge particularly. But I think having recorded it electronically first, and then just doing a quick double check, it's not particularly challenging. Whether it should be our responsibility to check that somebody has the right to be in the UK is a different question.
That is a different question and a whole different debate, isn't it? That
Exactly.
can go on for a long time, and we won't get into that. As a change of direction here, thinking of there's lots of talk about brand building and how people do that, and social media is very important. I saw that recently there's an agency that used TikTok. Is that something you do? I mean, how is your dancing?
Well, I'm a dad, and I would very much be in the dad dancing category.
Actually, to be fair, this agency, what they did was a series of tips and advice, so they weren't sort of doing the latest shuffle dance or whatever.
Interesting question, and I'm not the marketing lead, and I'm probably the anchor when it comes to marketing in our business. We're in a room industry. I think 95% of our tenants come through one particular channel. My view as a business owner is it can be very easy to get distracted by keeping up with all the latest trends. So, if we were putting stuff on Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, MySpace, YouTube, Facebook, whatever.
MySpace, hello.
Bebo, I don't know. I mean, you can tell I'm a child of the 90s here. But the problem is you can get distracted by doing all the things that marketing, Facebook, Twitter, all those people want you to spend money with them.
Of course.
So they're going to make it sound attractive. You've got to look as a business owner and say, what is effective for our business? 95% of our customers come through one particular channel. So really what I need is somebody employed full-time on there. From a property industry perspective, I see people using it very effectively to promote themselves as investors and as somebody who is investable for angel finance to help grow their business. So I probably see more of it on there than I do for tenants as a landlord or a letting agent. And on the branding overall side, I see a lot of people putting a lot of effort into the branding. And I have to say, tenants don't give a toss. They really couldn't care less. From their perspective, we're the landlord. They feel that they're talking to the person that can make the decision. The fact that we've got two houses in one city where the living room is painted the same colour and there's the same canvas in there because the landlord thinks that's their brand. The tenants have absolutely no concept of that whatsoever. Where it is useful is, as I said, where landlords are then using those images to project a professionalism that then allows them to access angel finance or bridging finance or whatever, that then allows them to grow their business. So I think if we're talking to investors as the audience here, I would say, look, by all means, social media is huge. We connect with a lot of people on social media who like and see what we do. It grows our business to business to consumer. I'm ambivalent, I think.
Is talking to people still a good idea then?
Definitely. And again, it's that right channel. So from a tenant's perspective, the channel they use, there's probably 2 or 3 channels. It's likely to be right move with single lets, and it's likely to be spare room with the room lets. What social media does for investors looking to build the brand is it allows people to watch what you're doing and then have a conversation with you. So I was away this weekend doing something completely unrelated to property for a change, back in my sort of social environment. And lots of people came up to me and said, "Oh, I've seen what you're doing. I've seen you just got a set of keys. I hear you bought a community centre." And I haven't. They're people I didn't expect and to see what I was doing, but they're watching, but they're not necessarily the ones that are clicking and commenting. And those people tend to be property people. The people who are quietly watching and then say, "What are you doing? How does this work?" They tend to be the people that like, and trust, but aren't necessarily in property because they're busy doing what you're doing. But that social media piece, what that does is it allows the people that are around you personally to connect with what you're doing.
And sparks a conversation.
You're absolutely right. It's
Yeah.
the conversation it sparks. It's the conversation is the valuable bit
Mm.
where things really happen. But you've got to do and that's where it is brand building, awareness building. And yes, I would say you've got to do that. I hate it. It's not something I enjoy doing. I find it quite challenging. I find it feels to me sometimes like sort of showing off, and I find that
Yeah,
uncomfortable. But I see the value of it,
there's a fine line, isn't there? And I think just being, yeah, you can seem to be showing off, but if you're showing that you can solve a problem or you can help somebody, that's I think that is far more, than saying, "Look at our beautiful house." But anyway,
yeah.
I'm conscious of time because I know, being a busy businessman that you are, you've got to head off. So I've got 2 things. I'm going to choose one.
Go on. I'll give you both.
All right then. Okay. Rent control, good or bad? It's on the horizon in Scotland. What happens in Scotland in property often trickles down south.
I'm
Mm.
not a fan, but you're probably not surprised to hear that. Look, I get it from a government perspective, from a social perspective. I understand. I'd love my rent to be controlled. I'm in the private rented sector. As a landlord, do I think it's fair that somebody controls my prices? Probably not.
Mm.
As a consumer of gas and electric, do I think the energy cap is useful? Yes. If I was an energy company, do I think it's probably forced some of my competitors to go bust? Yes. So,
Aforementioned agencies that give advice, they're very pro rent control, and I think it's one of Labour's tickets at the moment, is that they're keen on getting rent control in.
it's popular, isn't it?
Yeah.
Without being sort of too base and political here, the Labour Party are trying desperately to appeal to the electorate for the first time in 20 years. And they've got to do something. What I would say, Jeremy Corbyn, this was one of his sort of flagship policies, and that didn't really work for them, did it?
No.
So I do think there's an element where it sounds good politically. When it comes to it, I think most sensible people will say, I don't think we want to be in a world where the government controls a large part of the market.
Mm.
And I think overall they'll play with it and they'll have some kind of political success, but I think it will be done in such a way that it doesn't have a huge impact on landlords.
It's got to be fair, hasn't it? I mean,
It has to be fair.
Yeah, it's got to make the private rented sector sustainable. Otherwise, we will have even more people leaving because if your business doesn't pay, then there's no point. Okay.
Exactly.
There's so many sides to that, and you could look at different countries and cities around the world where it has happened and had a negative effect, and this, that, and the other. So we'll see. I mean, it's an ongoing thing, isn't it? I mean, in Scotland, it's within 5 years. So if it trickles into England and Wales, then there's probably going to be another 5 years on top of that. So I think it's a long way in the future. Something that's closer, though, is the rental reform bill. It's been around, bouncing around in Parliament for a while, which will include the abolishment of Section 21 and the shift to Section 8. There doesn't seem to be many firm details of how it's going to be put together at the moment. There's been talk of sort of regional courts that can be set up in community centres and to ease the pressure off the court system. Um, what's its flaw? What are the flaws at the moment, and where what new aspects of the possession process do you think need to come in?
Okay, it's funny because I've been. I mean, I remember when we started this business, I've recorded a few videos about this topic in particular. Maybe somebody listened. Who knows? So
Well, at
to
least
me, this
one, I'm sure.
so to me, this is very clearly about rights and responsibilities, and I'm a massive believer that people should have both in equal measure. So the removal of Section 21, I think, from a business owner's point of view, let's look at why you would use Section 21. You would use it because the tenant's done nothing wrong and you want the property back. So either you're selling it, or what tends to happen is a couple are separated, one goes one way, one goes the other way. One stays in the property, and then later on they find a new partner and they move to a new property. And whoever's left, whether they own it jointly or separately, decides to rent it out because there's not a lot of equity in it or whatever. Then something happens with that relationship, and they decide they want to move back into the family home, or it needs to get carved up in a divorce or whatever. Why is that the tenant's fault, and why should they have to be displaced from what is now their home
Mm.
because of something that's nothing to do with them? Okay, that's my view. That's why I think tenants should have the right to security and landlords should have the responsibility to provide it. But the flip side must be true, that if you're, otherwise, why would you evict a tenant who's looking after the property and paying the rent on time? The reality is you wouldn't, unless you were in a situation where you had to be forced to. Section 8 is where a tenant doesn't pay rent or causes antisocial behaviour. So if those two things are the case, and they've been given security of tenure by the landlord, and they've not respected either their neighbours, their community, or the landlord by paying the rent, why should they have the right to stay in that property? And I think that is a very simple A and B argument to say we strengthen the rights of tenants, but we also strengthen the responsibility of tenants. And the problem is, historically, the government have strengthened the rights and reduced the responsibility, or the ability to enforce the responsibility. So I think personally we're going down absolutely the right route with removing Section 21. I think landlords should still be able to have possession back at some point, but I think tenants need to be given a lot more notice and the ability to move and what have you, or compensation, for example. I think that's fine. As a business owner, if I want to sell my property that somebody's living in order to cash in and fund a bigger development, I think it's fair that I compensate that family for displacing them from their home.
Mm.
So I think that's fair. I also think that Section 28 should be strengthened, and you've hit the nail on the head with the issue about creating more courts. There needs to be the capacity for the enforcement process, whether that's judicial or fixed penalty, civil notice, to be enforced, and that largely comes down to capacity. So that's either funding more local authority enforcement, or creating more capacity in the court system, and potentially a simple housing court system,
Mm.
because it's a civil matter, doesn't need necessarily the same judicial level of scrutiny. It could be, lay people, for example. It's very simple. Can you prove you've paid the rent or not paid the rent? Can the landlord prove that you've not paid the rent? It's black and white. Antisocial behaviour a little bit more tricky, maybe.
Maybe that's
But
one
the
for
thresholds.
the actual courts then, the antisocial aspect, and like you say, the rental arrears is a for the I think they call it, they've been labelled things like housing court or housing tribunal, and I mean it is going to happen, isn't it? It's just going
I
to.
think so.
I don't think they've
And,
hit the
and,
mark
and
yet.
again, the reverse of that is, if we're going to have a housing court system, landlords should be dragged through that as well if they do the wrong thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
That whole court system should support both tenant and landlord in the right situation. If your landlord isn't doing the gas safety certificate, they should be hauled through that court system straight away. It's at the moment the ability for landlords to be bad landlords is it's there. It's
Mm.
easy for them to do it.
Yeah, it comes back to the funding we talked about earlier, and lack of resource to a degree.
Yeah, and that will then push the amateurs out. It will start to attack the slumlords, and then the whole ecosystem will be better because the local authority won't be fighting people who are doing deliberately wrong. They'll be able to provide a bit more training and support for those that want to do it right, and tenants can actually get what they deserve, which is good quality accommodation, and in return be expected to pay for it. Whether we then control the rent, I'm not sure, but that's all these things are connected. But I think landlords would accept a rent control that was fair as long as the protection against non-payment was fair, for example. So all of these things I think are about balance. But overall, rights and responsibilities for me is a big thing. That's a big part of my upbringing. And I think the vast majority of people would say the same thing. If there's fairness on both sides, then that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, look, this has been great. Thank you very much, Russ.
Okay. Sorry, I've gone off on a bit of a political rant there. But,
no, that's all right. I mean,
strongly, it's
this industry has a lot of political influences, and we are sometimes we do feel we are at the mercy of the government with all the regulations that have come through in the last over a decade now and longer. It's sometimes you can't help but get political, but we work with it and we find ways through.
Yeah.
So I'm going to let you go, get back to your business, and have a brilliant day. Thanks for joining me, Russ Dyble.
Thank you very much.